the Zobal, and I'm going to go over some more Guardian builds in this guide than my previous one. Now that I've had the time to play around with the new patch, you can see that it's better just to specialize builds since you can just retrade anywhere you want. It was best before to just go with the best overall build because you just would spend too much time running back to town every dungeon that you went to on your tour. It would just take more time than it's worth to change. But now that you can change wherever and whenever you want, it's best to specialize since there's a lot of areas that you don't really need much or any utility. Might as well just focus more on damage, especially now that the lower area dungeons are just ridiculously face roll now because things just melt with the way they downscale things. So with the help of the keys doing lots and lots of math, she was a big help in determining all this stuff, so thanks to her. And I had some additional input from No Trigger, so thanks to him as well. I present to you more Guardian builds and build diversity. So I'm going to go over the Greatsword Sword Focus builds first, and they're best for dungeons, open world, and some fractal bosses now that you can swap. And this is the build I went over the last time. It maximizes in damage and utility, so you want to use this when you actually need the utility because you're pugging or if fights are lasting long. Places like Ara, you need condition removal, you need lots of it. Okay, it gets more stability. So you get the option of always having Master Consecrations, and you get to run on Scathed Contender as well. It's not an either or situation, so that's good for this build. And if you need more condition removal than Purging Flames will give you, you can run Absolute Resolution instead. And if you want more stability, like you're fighting Simon or something, you can run Indomitable Courage. And it has the 15 in Radiance, which any good PVE build should have. You have Blind and Vuln spam. You have lots of blind skills on your bar with your rotations and your virtue, so that you'll be stacking a lot of vuln, doing lots of blinds, mitigating a lot of damage for your team. And this build gives you all the general damage multipliers. You get 10% while burning, condition, and you get 1% per boon. The only one that you're really missing is this one, but you don't hit it that often, so it's really not that great. And you get vitality and healing power as well. Not that great for a DPS build. And you get your weapon multipliers too. Greatsword and sword. Places where you really don't need that much utility, especially now that the lower level dungeons are pretty much a joke with the scaling, like AC, and other areas where you really didn't need much utility at all, like COF or KOF. Whenever you're just going for dungeon record runs, you want more damage. You could probably squeeze out about 5% more damage or so with these next two builds than the one I just showed before. And you get that from taking the 3 out of virtues, and you just dump it in to Zeal, Radiance, and Valor. And this is what you want to run if you do not have Spotter in your group. You want to run a different build, which I'll go over next. And you keep your 2 in virtues, so this allows you to take Master of Consecrations if you really need it for a certain fight in the dungeon that you're doing. It's really a nice option to have. Your other option with full DPS build would put the 2 in Valor, but the great thing about this build is you only need to keep this buff up 15% of the time to do the same amount of damage as 4 in Valor. So it's really worth running this build over that. You'll keep this buff up a lot more than that, since you should be running Retreat and using your virtues. You'll be able to keep pages up for quite a while. And you'll want to pick up Retributive Armor and Right-Handed Strength. So for a build that you do have spotter in your group, you want to swap your traits around just like I just did there. This variation requires about 20% Aegis uptime to compete with Foreign Valor. And there are a few instances where Scepter is the way to go. If the target has a huge hitbox and doesn't move like Lupicus, you can just swap your trait to Scepter Power instead of Zealous Blade. There are a few areas where it's still pretty good to use, and you want to use it instead of your sword for rotations. Things that have decent sized hitbox like the AC bosses, you can take that as well. If you're able to maximize your scepter use, you can bring 6 in Zeal and 6 in Radius for right-handed strength, and both scepter and greatsword traits. That's a lot of work to do. It's up to you. This is going to be your bar for the most part for dungeons. There are a few cases where it'll change, but I'm not really going to go over that in this build guide. You can check my other guide for skill uses and rotations and such. The other build is the hammer build. This is what you should be using for fractals. It's also great for people that are new to the game, that are struggling or earpugging. Permanent protection is really strong. It's one of the best supportive things that any class has for the group. So with this build, you have your Master Consecrations, and again your Blind Bolt spam. And then you're running a hammer, so you want to trait for Writ of Persistence. This will increase your damage. It'll give you permanent prot, and it'll give you more vulnerability. You can keep up around 6 vuln if you just do nothing but spam your hammer auto chains. And you get your big damage multipliers, your 10 burning, and 10 for condition. And this trait really sucks. There's really nothing here. If you're fighting a hard fractal boss, you can go with Powerful Blades because you'll need a swap of Sword Focus for the focus block. I usually just go with Radiant Fire for the burning duration because there's really nothing else that's great. And you want Shout Cooldown in your Adept line of honor. It's really great for fractals because you can use Retreat more, and you want to be doing blocking rotations in fractals with your Aegis's, Shelter, Focus 5, Renewed Focus. You can block for a very long time. And for your trait here, if you're doing underwater content, you can swap to Two-Handed Mastery. And if you're fighting Imbued Shaman, you want to change this to Spear Weapon Mastery so your shield's up at every transition with this bubble. So it's the same with the hammer. You can just put all your points towards DPS for places where you need little to no utility, like the dungeons and situations I said before, the other builds. And some bosses for fractals, the hammer is really nice for prot. So you still want to run it like for Lornar or Diviner, or you don't need reflex or removal or anything. But they still hit really hard. You just want to run this instead. And you'll gain a good 10% damage over the other build. It's a lot bigger cap than the Greatsword Sword Focus. The only thing is you lose your option of Consecrations because it takes about 40% uptime of Unscathed to compete. That's kind of a lot. So with this build you gain 10% symbol damage. A lot of your hammer damage comes from symbols, so that's pretty strong. You also get your damage multiplier on your greatsword. Odds are you should be using a greatsword and swap. You can do DPS rotations and you'll get the damage from that too. And the rotations of hammer, greatsword are pretty identical to greatsword, sword focus. Just you don't run hammer builds for all out damage because breaking up the hammer chain leads to a big DPS loss. Greatsword Sword Focus is a lot of constant DPS, and it's easier to achieve the max that you can get from that. If you're doing fractals, this should pretty much be your bar. You want lots of reflex and projectile destruction. So for gear, you want all Berserker gear. There are a few cases like the hammer build or certain build situations where having Assassin's Armor and Zerk the rest is best, but there's more cases where having full Zerk is the way to go. And the difference is pretty minimal, so I just go with full Zerk. And you want Scholar Runes. If you don't think you can keep up the buff for very long, Strength Runes are your next best choice. Assuming you have your buff on your Strength Runes up 100% of the time, you'll need to keep up the buff about 40% of the time for Scholar to compare. And if you're new or struggling starting out, or you just don't feel comfortable in Zerker gear, you just don't want full Zerk, you can go with light Celestial or Soldier Armor, Zerk everything else. Just going by the hammer build with the utility, you will be looking at about 8 to 15% less damage. It's not too bad if you really need it. But for runes, sigils, you want Night and Force. It's the best choice, at least for night. For daytime, you want Force and Accuracy. If your group really sucks at stacking might because you're bugging, or you're doing fractals without failing Strength Warrior or something, or you're doing open world, having Force and Strength would be a better choice. But you want to just use it on hammer and sword focus, not greatsword. And you want set for bloodlust and set for perception. Depending on your build situation, you want to stack one or the other. You also want a set of underwater weapons with a sigil on each. Depending on what you're running, you'll keep the stacks and you can swap out of your land weapon and still have the stacks because you have it on your underwater weapon. And as far as other weapons, you should just have a staff. Never fight with it. You can use it for line of warding or to pull stuff to line of sight spots. Swap immediately to the hammer and start attacking. It's usually just good for fractals, or if you have a hammer. And scepter for the reasons why I said before. Something with decent size hitbox that won't move. It's better than having a sword. For infusions, precise seems to be the best overall. There's probably some sweet spot of precise and mighty. Don't know what it is. And the difference is really minimal between the two. It's up to you what you want to do. I'd just say go with precise. That's what I have. As far as camping weapons go, for greatsword, you'll probably, if you want to camp greatsword, you'll probably be missing out on good 10% damage compared to doing rotations with sword focus. And sword, you have even more of a loss, around 30% even. And for hammer, if you're running hammer build, you'll lose about 10%, but I'd say that's worth it to get permaprot. It's good to rotate for easier fights though, so I would do that. So these are all the different builds and situations that you'll be in, and what food and stacks you want to get, considering that you have powerful potions on. And if you're interested in seeing different skills and stuff you should use in more depth or rotations and such, you can check out my other guide. I linked to the parts on it in the beginning of the video so you can scroll back and look at them. And thanks again to the keys for doing all the math. It's a lot of work. Pretty much helped me figure out what's most optimal for everything there is to be a guardian. And we also have public forums on our DnT site now. So if you want to get up to date on the meta for all the classes, you can go ahead and check that out. And you can discuss theory crafting there as well, on all the different professions or just in general, with a lot of respected members of the community as well as people in our guild. Great place for information to share ideas, so go ahead and check that out. I linked to it in the description of the video. It's up to you. And see you next time.